Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christensen. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kashaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
Hey, Dr. C with you. So today's guest is Garth Davis, Dr. Garth Davis. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from University of Texas in Austin. He was the student government president, and he attended med school at Baylor College of Medicine, was in the top 10%. So he's been a bariatric surgeon now for 17 years, and he's written a book called Proteinaholic. That's one of his two books that's out, but he's been very active in the plant-based community. Dr. Davis and I talked about protein and possible dangers of dietary protein, and got to say, he's a real sharp guy. I enjoyed our conversation, and I think he does a good job being true to the evidence and looking at that and getting past a lot of the biases people can get stuck into. So please enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Garth Davis. Garth, thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here, Alan.
So the discussion here is protein, and this is a huge important point that we put a lot of thought into, and we all want to get right in terms of maintaining our health. You know, the opposing views, one side thinks about the drawbacks of too little and problems of sarcopenia and changes to health span because of that. And one side thinks about too much and possible disease risks. And I want to just throw out my current perspective just to make that apparent as a starting point. I just glanced through some studies again before jumping on, and I completely see good evidence that high intakes of smoked and cured meats, somewhere about 30 grams a day or more, can raise the risks for stomach and esophageal cancers. You know, I think that's pretty clear. I also see some good evidence about, actually it surprised me, mixed evidence about red meat above maybe 60 grams a day raising colorectal cancer risk. And I saw that inconclusive from the last large meta-analysis. But then I did see evidence about red meat at similar thresholds, especially early in life, possibly raising development for breast cancer. So no debate about that. And also I think it's clear that diets that include fair amounts of plant proteins, nuts and seeds, beans and legumes, show just tremendous benefits for lots of conditions, cancers, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular disease. I personally don't see strong human outcome evidence that smaller amounts of red meat or typical amounts of poultry or seafood do raise cancer risks. And I do see a lot of mechanistic evidence and possible biomarkers, but when I see larger outcome studies from humans, I don't see that. So that's where I'm at, and let's jump in, and I'm completely open to any insights.
Right. Well, first of all, that was a very logical and thoughtful response, because that's not typically, of course, what we see in the world, right? So, I've been treating lifestyle disease for 18 years and in a very comprehensive manner, and I've gone through all kinds of thoughts on this. At one point, I was a very high protein advocate and wrote a book saying you should do protein first. A lot of the problems obviously are going to come in the extremes. I saw a patient recently who came to see me, NASA scientist, smart lady, rocket scientist, recently immigrated from Ghana. She was in Ghana and been in America for 10 years. Comes to see me, overweight, hypertension, high cholesterol. And I always ask my patients, why do you think you're in this situation? And she says, because of carbs, which is odd because I then look at her diet. Her diet is eggs for breakfast, a chicken for lunch, chicken for dinner. And I'm like, I don't see any carbs in your diet.
She's not on a high carb diet.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, I don't get it. There's no carbs in your diet. She said, well, I'm from Ghana, and once in a while I get together with my family and friends from Ghana, and we eat a typical Ghana meal, which is really high in carbohydrates. And I said, well, okay, have you been back to Ghana? And she's like, yes. I was like, is there anybody overweight in Ghana? She's like, no, nobody. And of course, Ghana has one of the lowest obesity rates. And I said, okay. And she's like, you know what? When I was there, I actually lost weight. I was like, of course you did, because it's not the carbs that are causing your issues. It's just a complete disconnect where we're in this situation now in this world where people fear carbs like crazy, and they think fruit is bad for you. And we have a world that in America where they actually think fruit is bad for you, which I simply just, I just, blows my mind. Now, there's some real big problems in trying to study the epidemiology and the cancer risk looking at meat alone. So if you mentioned you looked at a few studies and you scanned through a few studies, but you got to understand that just isn't going to be adequate, because epidemiology in and of itself is going to have some vital flaws. Now, people.
Well, and I should clarify. Meta-analysis are a bit different because they're structured reviews of going through the full body of knowledge. You're right. You could pick through and find isolated things here and there, but yeah.
There was actually a recent JAMA article about the problems with meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis could sometimes even make it worse.
Sure.
Because with a meta-analysis, now you're grouping together patients from different studies that have different evaluation tools. So a lot of them will control for one thing, but won't control for another. And there is some cherry picking in many meta-analysis. I could tell you one big time one if we get to it, we start to talk to heart disease. But if we're talking about cancer, you got to understand that, first of all, cancer is a long process. It is not something that develops right away, right? It develops over time. A lot of the epidemiology, like for instance, there was a study that came out that said veganism leads to more to shorter life expectancy, and the study was actually a cross-sectional analysis that they called a prospective study. And what they did is they took a group of people and they asked them in a cross-sectional analysis type manner, what do you eat? What's your diet? And they didn't actually have a vegan diet. It was a vegetarian diet. They still ate some dairy. And they then looked 5 years later at mortality statistics. They didn't call the patient or anything. They just looked at mortality statistics and said, oh, this person who said they ate a vegetarian diet is now dead. Understand the huge errors in that. They never knew how long that patient had been vegetarian. They didn't know if that patient stayed vegetarian. The patient may have had heart disease, and so they became vegetarian and described themselves as vegetarian at the time of that study, but then died of their heart disease because they didn't stay vegetarian. And that's what a lot of these studies that get into these meta-analyses look like.
So there can be flaws in epidemiology and flaws in meta-analysis,
right.
But I guess I know of no better tools than those of science to figure out what's happening.
Exactly. But the way I approach it is to look at it this way. You got to look at it, and I wrote this in my book, and Walter Longo, who's an expert in aging at USC, had just put it in his recent book. But you've got to look at multiple different modalities. So number one, you absolutely have to look at epidemiology, because we are not going to have a situation where we're going to do a randomized controlled trial of a diet for 20 years. It's not going to happen. So we do have to look at epidemiology. It's important, but you got to look at the right kind of epidemiology. So for instance, the EPIC data is an excellent database, and it's shown a very strong correlation between red meat and processed meat in the development of cancers. And it's also shown the correlation between dairy and eggs and prostate cancer. And that's been, so you can't just take one database, you want multiple databases. So the EPIC database is very strong. The Harvard nurses health study.
And that's the benefit of meta-analysis, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you got to look at all of those together. You have to look at some of the issues with it. So like in the EPIC data study, it's important to look at things. First of all, you got to look at a sick population bias. So in other words, if you're looking at a body of people where, let's say you're looking at heart disease, where there's such a high rate of heart disease, you may not see an effect controlling for all the controls that you put in and just looking at a diet, because for instance, a light meat eater and a heavy meat eater, and you're comparing the two and you're saying, well, there's no difference, but there's such a high prevalence of heart disease in that population. There could be a statistic or at least a trend, and it's being missed. The other thing that you also see is healthy volunteer bias. So some of the EPIC data, they notice that in the beginning, the control group, or let's say like the less meat group, or the heavy meat group would start to act healthier just because they knew they were under study. But you could tell that difference by looking at data even later than they reported and seeing if it's reverting back. But anyway, epidemiology is complicated, but in general, if you look at it, and I cite so many different, I mean, I could give you a library of data. There is very strong correlation between meat and red meat with cancer, and dairy and eggs with hormonal cancers such as prostate cancer and breast cancer. But that's a little bit tougher. We'll get into that in a second. But let's say you've got epidemiology. You also ought to have a kind of a view of some of the healthy populations out there. So I do like the blue zones. They're not vegan or vegetarian. They're societies that you go and look at, and they're living long, healthy lives. And what are they doing? And what are they eating?
I don't think that I don't have any argument with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not vegan or vegetarian. They are consuming some animal proteins. They've got a lot of other positive health habits. It's tough to say which ones are most relevant. So I think that's important, but it's really hard to isolate protein as a variable using that data.
It is, but I'm talking about a bigger picture now. So we're looking at them. So what's the average percentage protein intake in an Okinawan? What's the average percentage intake of protein in a Sardinian? And we've got that kind of data. And we do have, in fact, in Sardinia, they've done some very good studies where they've actually done multivariate regression analysis where they said, let's control for this, let's control for that. And actually, people don't know this, but Sardinia is not a blue zone. It's the people in the mountains of Sardinia. I mean, there's a big difference between coastal Sardinians, and people don't understand all the complexities in this data.
They also had a really high bread intake, which often shocks people. I'm not carb phobic either. I think that's gotten quite serious.
Right. Very high bread intake and very low protein intake. The typical protein in all these blue zones is about 10 to 12% of their total calorie intake. So you've got epidemiology, you've got healthy populations. Then you got to get into mechanism of action. So if I'm going to tell you meat, for instance, correlates with colon cancer, which it does in many studies, and there were a couple studies where it didn't, but there's some explanations to that we could get to. But what's the mechanism of action? Well, it can be N-nitrosamine, it can be heterocyclic amines, it can be, there's a bunch of different things that we've looked at. There's it can be the lack of butyrate in people that are eating a predominantly meat-based, non-vegetable-based diet. Obviously, that gets taken away. The other thing is that in epidemiology, it's tough because there's not just one thing causing the cancer. So I could show you that cooked meat versus like a pan-fried meat versus a non-pan-fried meat, there's going to be more heterocyclic amines that are produced. And I could then show you several prospective studies where they showed that giving someone heme iron or giving them cooked meat increases N-nitrosamines and increases heterocyclic amines, and this increases a toxic effect in the bowel. So I could show you that in a prospective study.
Mechanistic studies are important. I completely agree. But I would argue that they're important in a sense that they're necessary but not sufficient. If we have a finding and we have no mechanistic model to explain that would refute the finding.
Exactly.
But mechanistic models are pretty easy to generate for any side of an argument. So they're not that useful by themselves.
They're not useful by themselves, but that's what I'm trying to build here is an argument that you then have.
You can always make mechanistic arguments. You never really lack a mechanistic argument for most anything.
Oh boy, there's some very lacking mechanistic arguments. I could show you a million of them. They're carbs causing diabetes.
Oh, I agree that that's not a strong cause, but there are many who would argue that there are more shallow understandings by which you can make mechanistic arguments for that. So I'm saying by themselves, I don't find those very compelling.
No, you got to show me a scientific article that will show me a mechanism by how a carb intake is causing diabetes.
At a deep level, I'm completely with you.
Yeah.
But at a superficial understanding of physiology, many don't think past simple insulin responses.
Right. But
So
that's what I,
that's where mechanistic models can really not be helpful for differentiating findings.
right. But I could show you the mechanism of why that's not true. The point is that,
I agree.
yeah, the point is that so we're building an argument here. So we've got epidemiology that suggests something.
But the consensus of current epidemiology, I don't see it suggesting that. I see certainly if we choose certain models of that, we see it, but I don't see, I've got the most recent reviews and meta-analysis in terms of prostate cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer. They're consistent with my opening statement that red meat above some thresholds can be a risk, but they don't see that other types of protein are relevant.
Oh, no, I'm just talking about red and processed meat.
Okay, so in my opening statement about other types of meat, were there things there that you would disagree with?
No. I mean, I would with prostate cancer for sure. There's definitely very, very strong correlation between.
I was surprised on that, and I'm not gone deep in this one, but the most recent meta-analysis from 2018 found no relationship between protein intake and prostate cancer.
I've got several here that I could send you if you want. Are you going to put these all on the website? I've got about.
I sure will, for sure.
I've got several meta-analyses and several.
And I've really got no dog in the fight here. I've got no bias or no side I'm on this. I just want to figure out the best data.
Oh yeah, no, I could send you. There's multiple studies, and you got to really look at some of the Asian studies because they're the most interesting. Especially there's a large Korean database of 2 million people that is probably one of the best studies because they have such a low prostate cancer risk in general, but now they're having an increasing risk of prostate cancer. But getting back to the argument, if you're doing an epidemiology study and you're looking at, for instance, red or processed meat and colon cancer, but then you control for vegetable intake, which is what they did in the EPIC data analysis, that takes away some of the effect because we know in these mechanism of action studies, if you then feed someone an antioxidant, it does block some of this effect. It blocks some of the nitrosamine. It blocks some of that. So like in one of the EPIC data studies, they controlled for vegetable intake, they controlled for weight, they controlled for fiber intake. And so they basically created an extraordinarily healthy comparison group to a vegan group. And the vegan group still did better, but it attenuated the effect, basically over adjustment bias. But the way I basically try to build, the way I came about this when I was trying to decide what do I tell a patient to eat, what is the answer, is to build these very complex kind of models. So, for instance, with prostate cancer, the Harvard, I mean, you could look at prostate cancer and you could do a univariate analysis. You could say in Japan, they've got less prostate cancer than us. They eat less meat than us. Therefore, meat causes prostate cancer. Obviously, that's a bad study. Maybe it's because they don't check PSA. Maybe it's genetic, et cetera, et cetera. But we know in studies where people from Japan have moved to America, migration studies, they start getting American incidence of prostate cancer. So then you could start saying, well, let's look at a prospective epidemiologic study, and that's what the Harvard Health Professions study did. And they showed a very strong correlation between dairy consumption and developing prostate cancer, and with egg consumption and the chance of prostate cancer being aggressive. And so that's just epidemiology, and we've already pointed out there's many different problems.
And I guess another point too is that in all these things, it's always a dose threshold. It's never did you have a drop of egg once per year.
No,
it's
right.
a matter of there's some point where it's relevant, some point where it's not. I think that's a good point that people often miss too. We think about things in very binary ways, like being good or bad, and that's never an accurate representation of the science. There's always thresholds and always relevant amounts.
Yeah, and usually in science we try to do it in quintiles, so we break it into 5 quintiles. But you're right, though, and this is where epidemiology, I mean, people don't understand epidemiology. It is hard, very hard in epidemiology to get a significant effect. Because in good epidemiology, you're doing a multifactorial regression analysis where you're trying to control for all confounding figures. And so what you're ending up with is two populations that end up being very similar, so it's hard to show a difference. So if there is a difference, that really means something. If there's multiple epidemiologic databases that show a difference, you ought to be listening. But then, for instance, like prostate cancer, so I've said, okay, there's epidemiology epidemiologic evidence. What's the mechanism of action? Well, we know that high leucine and high protein could cause high IGF-1, and we know that high IGF-1, for instance, people with acromegaly have high rates of prostate cancer. But then you should do some kind of randomized controlled trial to look at this, and so they did a randomized controlled trial. They cut out all animal protein on people with an elevated PSA of 7 and early diagnosed prostate cancer, and it actually dropped their PSA considerably by taking out all animal protein products. And so,
And dropped the PSA, it dropped the outcome of prostate cancer.
yes. Well, to do a randomized controlled trial dropping the outcome of prostate cancer would be very difficult. That'd have to be a
Right.
very long term,
That's
because
my point.
yeah. So, but the point being, if we have mechanism of action and we've got population studies and we've got epidemiology and we've got a randomized controlled trial showing an effect to our hypothesis, we got a pretty strong argument. None of those factors.
If our epidemiology, if these are consistent, across findings, but
Right,
if they're
but
inconsistent, then that's difficult.
But they are fairly consistent across the
That's not the
different things.
consensus of those who have written the last few meta-analysis in terms of prostate cancer, at least.
What meta-analysis are you talking about? Because I've got several here. Can you tell me your source?
Sure.
Because I have to go and look at it specifically, because this is the biggest mistake people make in my observation, is to just quote a random meta-analysis that they saw online. That is a humongous mistake, because tons of those meta-analyses will choose group studies that we know are offshoots. Like there was one meta-analysis of 5 different studies that ignored 15 different studies that showed positive correlation between meat and colon cancer. So, I mean, I could give you the biggest databases in the country and their studies and their meta-analyses of that. But just saying there's a meta-analysis that shows that you're wrong is not good science. In fact, it's horrible science. Meta-analysis can be fraught with problems and complications. And in fact, nowadays, I don't even really look at meta-analysis as much as I look at individual studies from known large group population studies of scientists I trust. Because if you're going to do a meta-analysis, and in your meta-analysis, you're putting together some of the worst studies out there and ignoring some of the better studies, that's a real problem. So what meta-analysis are you talking about that says that meat, what are you talking about, with prostate cancer or with meat? What are you talking about?
I can send some links over.
I've got these send links, because this is like one of my biggest problems right now, is that people don't know how to read a meta-analysis, and they will read. What's surprising to me now is how people, one of my biggest problems now is that people will cite a meta-analysis by just reading the conclusion and say, well, meta-analysis now show this, and read the conclusion. And you're like, oh my God, you didn't go and read through the methodology. You didn't look at the studies that were in the meta-analysis. You don't know, because this isn't your field, that there were 5 other studies that were not put into this meta-analysis. Like, for instance, do you know the Siri-Torino study?
I do not.
Okay, so the Siri-Torino study was a meta-analysis that was done in, I can't remember when it was, 2011, 2012, that really started the whole debate over whether saturated fat causes heart disease.
Oh, I'm familiar with that then, yes.
And so that study said that saturated fat was not correlated with heart disease based on meta-analysis. Now,
and they didn't really look adequately at carb substitution, and processed
they
carbs.
didn't look at that. They left out several huge, really important studies.
And that was corrected by future follow-up studies.
It was, and it was corrected. And Jeremiah Stamler wrote a scathing critique of it in New England Journal of Medicine, and they had huge over-adjustment bias. So in other words, when they did the meta-analyses, the studies they used controlled for cholesterol.
Yeah. So future better studies did see through that. And that's the progression of science. That's the benefit of science, is that these things do get sorted out over time. And we're never perfect in the moment, but we do improve.
No, we never are. But we're still debating this. There's still people that are out there saying that saturated fat does not cause heart disease. It's a huge movement.
Right, but they're not with the most current literature in doing so.
They're not. But there was a recent Cochrane analysis that said that saturated fat does cause heart disease.
Right.
But you could see where a meta-analysis could throw people off.
And that's my point, is that science does progress over time. We do weed through those things, and our most current data is better than our prior data.
Right. And
it's never perfect.
It's never perfect. But if you look right now at the most recent World Health Organization's review of the data on meats and whether or not they cause cancer. Red meat was a class 2A, meaning
Sure.
probably, and processed meat was a class 1, meaning they're quite certain that that is a carcinogen.
And I see that data. I don't debate
Yeah.
that.
That's not debatable. I think you could go into it's hard on some of these other things. So like poultry,
Right.
that's going to be really tough. Poultry, there is correlation with lymphoma, but that's going to be tough. Fish, I got no argument against fish. I've never seen any studies anywhere correlating fish with cancer. Now you kind of this does get into mechanism of action. So why does fish not cause cancer and other meats have been shown to cause cancer, red meat specifically? Because one of the arguments is that it's IGF-1, and fish definitely increases IGF-1. There's no question. But fish does not increase N-nitrosamine compounds. Fish typically doesn't develop as many heterocyclic amines when cooked. And the other thing is that people that eat fish,
have different habits.
yeah, they tend to be.
They might be different
even when
socioeconomic status. They might have different smoking
Right.
status, different activity levels. Right.
Right. And so that's what makes it so complex. Like there was I don't know if you know the PURE study.
Yeah.
So the PURE study is quoted a lot because it actually showed that people that ate a higher protein were healthier than the people that ate a higher carb diet. But when you go and look at that study, the group that was eating the higher carb diet were very poor in.
They were poor.
Yeah.
They were consuming nothing but rice, and they were consuming
Right,
like
nothing but
over
rice.
75% carbohydrate. And it's basically just white rice.
Just
And
white rice.
and I think we could have fun with this, but many would take that as an argument against carbs and towards low carb diets. But what they
Right.
called low carb diets in that study was like 50% carbohydrate.
Right. It was. It's crazy. And not just that, it was these people didn't have access to healthcare.
Right.
They lived in really bad. So that's why you got to look at each study individually
Completely.
and dissect it. And so one of my favorite studies out there, because it's such a good database, is the Adventist Health Studies.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the Adventist Health Study, you've got an interesting population now, and they've been studied since the 70s, right? So the Adventist Health population was first studied because they were looking at smoking versus not smoking. And the Adventists believed that the body is the temple of the soul, and they were willing to be studied. And so Loma Linda is the center of the Adventists, and Loma Linda University was there, so they started doing a database with them. And yes, they don't smoke, and so yes, they did better than the rest of the population. But they found something very interesting in the Adventist population. They all get good amount of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
They all pretty much don't smoke. They all have very healthy eating habits. So there's no
They've got great social cohesion.
great social cohesion. They're all in this big community together. So they're all pretty healthy to begin with. So there's no healthy user bias. There's no healthy volunteer effect. It's just a healthy population. But there's an interesting difference in their diet because none of them eat a lot of meat, but some of them eat some red meat. Some of them don't eat any red meat, but do eat poultry. Some of them are pesco vegetarian. Some of them are vegetarian, and some of them are vegan. And this has led to some fascinating studies looking through, well, what's the difference between a vegan and a vegetarian when it comes to cancer? And what's the difference between a vegan, a vegetarian, and a light meat eater when it comes to heart disease and diabetes and longevity? And these have been fascinating studies because I can't imagine a better study group. And I got to give it to the Loma Linda researchers because they didn't want any appearance of bias, so they sent their data out for individual assessment from non-biased sources to try to blind epidemiology as best as you could. And their data is really fascinating because there is a difference between, let's say, a vegan and a vegetarian, and there's a difference between a vegetarian and a light meat eater with all these disease processes. And that I think is pretty strong data, especially when you look at multivariate regression analysis. And if you really want to look at cancer and animal protein, I would Orlick in, I think, 2013, 2015, wrote an excellent review of the literature of the Adventist Health group and looked at, what is the difference? Because we talked about dosage. What's the difference in the dosage of these animal proteins in this very controlled group that we could look at? And there definitely is a difference. The less animal protein, the better, except for one exception, and that's the pesco vegetarians. The pesco vegetarians did as well, if not better, than the vegans in many of the different parameters, which is why I've got no argument against fish. I can never tell someone not to eat fish.
I guess in general, something that has concerned me is that we'll often want to pull out a certain variable, like we love tomatoes because of lycopene, or we fear tomatoes because of lectins, which is just silly. Or
Silly.
or with Mediterranean diets, I've actually got a dear friend who's working on a book, and I won't mention too many details, but he's arguing that the Mediterranean diet could be improved upon by removing grains. And I'm saying, well, we can't conclude that, because the data we have arguing that it's good is based on how they did it, which did include grains. So we can't assume that if you take out a variable, it'd be different. And that's where I struggle, because anytime you look at what happens in a population, you can't honestly say it was this one variable. You can only say it's the sum total. It's like baking a cake. You can't say this is a great cake, but if you leave out this, it'll be the same. Well, you don't know that till you try. And so that's
right.
That's where I think it's important to try to model those patterns as best we can, but not get too focused on thinking that there was just one variable that's important that we can extrapolate.
Right. And a lot of the epidemiologic researchers now are echoing what you're saying. So like you'll notice in the Harvard studies nowadays, they aren't looking at one thing anymore. What they're doing now is looking at patterned eating behavior.
Yeah.
And so they're looking at what they call a healthy patterned eating behavior or unhealthy patterned eating behavior. And, to the vegans out there, they get really angry because the healthy patterned eating behavior includes poultry and fish and things like that. But I'm okay with it because like we've said before, we don't have strong data showing those things do cause cancer. And so if you're going to do a cancer study and looking at healthy eating behavior, or heart disease and looking at healthy eating behavior, I think it's a good variable to look at, because I get really bothered in these studies where they say, okay, we're going to study meat versus non-meat, but we're going to control for vegetable intake, because that vegetable intake could be protecting the meat eaters.
Right.
And it makes it really hard to study. And it reminds me, because there was this great study in Africa, because they were looking at, colorectal cancer rates are just shooting. I can't believe the amount of colorectal cancer I see nowadays.
Oh, younger and younger people. Yeah.
Younger and younger. I did a colon resection on a 48-year-old recently.
Oh, shoot.
And so, and we're seeing it. One of my colorectal colleagues is seeing it like 30-year-olds. So they were looking at it in South Africa, and this guy O'Keefe did this amazing study, because he was looking at, he did biopsies of the colon, and he looked at white South Africans that had really high rates of colon cancer, and he compared it to black South Africans, and he looked at their diet, and the diet was very different, and he thought that fiber was going to be the key. But what he noticed,
usually that doesn't pan out.
Yeah, it doesn't pan out. It pans out a little bit, but not. There are some studies that show it does. It's weak. Let's just say it's weak.
Yeah.
But what he found in that study, that it was actually the higher the meat and the higher end nitrosamine compounds in the white South Africans was what was leading to more of the problems. But you could understand that if you were to do an epidemiologic study over there, and it could get really mucked up if you're combining the two populations together. So that's why you got to start looking at these individual studies where they actually have more specific controls, where you could look at variables that are long-term, because the interesting thing about that study was these whites have been eating that way for many, many years, and the black population, they've been eating that way for many, many years. So it was a more reliable than doing a randomized controlled trial.
I'd be curious about the difference in their resistant starch intake.
Yeah, they were eating boiled maize, which usually when you boil maize, you would get resistant starch, but I don't know if they were looking at resistance. But that's an important point too, because now you're getting into something else that I've been studying more and more, is what are the effects on our diet on microbiome? Because we're getting more and more on the evidence of microbiome, which is another way that, meat consumption could be affecting us. And certainly resistant starch is really beneficial for the microbiome.
We always have to distinguish too, is it the intake of this, or is it the not intake of that? You can never change one part of the diet. If you're taking something out, you're adding something in, or you're eating less, which is still a relevant variable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what happened in the heart studies. They have such a hard time. If we're not eating saturated fat, we are eating this. And how does that change?
Processed carbohydrate.
Yeah. I mean, right now.
And they only concluded that one was no worse than the other.
Right. One's no worse than the other. I mean, processed carbs were bad. Saturated fat was bad. But it's hard to do those studies. I think you look now, because I laugh, because I don't know if you know Kevin Hall, but he's a researcher.
Yeah.
A fantastic researcher. He's doing he's doing gangbuster research. research. I mean, they're doing these ward studies. I don't know who volunteers to do a month at NIH sitting in a room eating what Kevin feeds them. But the funny thing is how hard a time, I mean, Kevin's got this situation where he could sit someone down and say, this is what you're going to eat, and we're going to compare it to you. So he's doing exactly what we say is almost impossible to do, is to study someone long-term on a certain diet. But he even is having a problem because he's, the low carb people are saying, well, if you're going to do low carb, I mean, how much protein? I mean, does he hold protein stable, or does he? Because you got to hold something stable if you're going to compare two groups, and that becomes really difficult because there's going to be someone. I mean, if you're holding protein stable, then the protein guy like me is going to say, well, maybe that's the problem. So it's really hard to study nutritional science. It's really difficult. But my point above and beyond all of this is it's very difficult, but there's a lot of good science out there where you could make educated assumptions. And I think those educated assumptions are pretty decent. And you know what those educated assumptions are? Exactly what you said when we opened this discussion, is that there is a pretty good evidence that red meat and processed meat are related to cancer. There's pretty good evidence that it's related to heart disease. And I don't think that people need to go vegan, but I do think we need to change the way we look at our diet and eat a higher fruit, vegetable, bean diet with a lower meat diet. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that assumption.
And something that interests me a lot is just how even independent of the accuracy of a message is how that message is acted upon by a population. So like, for example, there was a study about cardiovascular death increasing in those who went gluten-free. And I saw many who didn't really like that conclusion. And they said, they must have consumed less fiber. They must have had more sugar. They must have had more processed foods. Well, those were all controlled variables and they were not relevant. Right. But the decrease in whole grain intake was a relevant finding. And that was the one that correlated with the death increase. Yeah. So the question is, how do things play out? Or intermittent fasting. I hear many crow about how that's helped them. And maybe it has. Whenever we see larger studies, it seems that the effects are not greater than would have been expected by simple food restriction. The timing didn't seem to matter. But maybe for some people, that's a rubric that causes them to spontaneously eat less. So it's always curious to think about how a message plays out. And I'm always concerned that if someone focuses too hard on one variable, maybe that would work out well for them, or maybe they would end up just doing that thing really well and then lowering their food quality or doing worse on their food total intake.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, though I practice a vegan diet myself, I don't tell my patients to do that. Like, my diet recommendations for my patients is probably very similar to your diet recommendations, which would be, a healthy diet, or these healthy patterned eating that we see. I mean, the DASH diet or the flexitarian type diets that you see U.S. World News Report touting as the best diets out there. I do think they're the best diets out there. They're very balanced diets that are heavy in fiber, that are heavy in fruit and vegetable intake, and low in meat intake, but they're not vegan. And I do think those are the diets that seem to be working the easiest for people. I don't think taking one variable and trying to control that is the answer.
Well, there may be some, and the difficulty though is that the most accurate messages like that, they're nuanced. And sometimes the messages that go viral and seem simple, they're not. And so that's a trade-off too. And is it better because people can remember something easy and stick with one rule? Does that make it more effective? I honestly don't feel like I have clear answers to that.
Oh, look, I've been trying to find that clear answer for a long time. I do find that there are people where saying you got to eat a healthy diet, that just doesn't work. Right. They need, there was this saying that doing something 100% is easier than doing something 99%.
Right.
Because there's a line in the sand. And so that's why you see these people on keto diets and they're like, I'm doing so well. It's because they've got a very strict plan.
Right.
And they know what they can eat and they can't eat. I do see that in whole food plant-based diet eaters too, where they're like, I'm only going to eat whole food plant-based diet. Those people do fantastic. It's very different than a vegan diet, because a vegan diet, you could be eating Oreos.
Sure.
But a whole food plant-based diet says, I'm going to eat nothing but a whole food plant-based diet. They do fantastic. So sometimes these extremes do work and people need that kind of, wall. And in our clinic, we try to meet the patient where they're at and try to decipher, is that what they need, or do they need a more reasonable diet?
We'll be right back after a word from Integrative Health.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. This is Dr. Linda Koshaba at Integrative Healthcare. So often we hear from our patients that their primary care physician has told them that their thyroid and hormone levels are fine, and they shouldn't worry. But the patients still have symptoms of severe fatigue, thinning hair, and weight issues. Unfortunately, this is too common with thyroid care. The good news is that we can help. There is hope. The doctors at Integrative Health, including myself, specialize in naturally treating thyroid, hormone, and adrenal issues. We would love to get you started on the path of ideal health. From the comfort of your own home, you can actually get treatment with one of our doctors at Integrative Health via a telemedicine appointment. Go to integrativehealthcare.com and become a new patient today. If you use the code PODCAST20, you get 20% off your new patient visit. Again, that website is integrativehealthcare.com and use code PODCAST20. Get back on the road to thriving.
And now, back for more medical myths, legends, and fairy tales. So total random thing, but this is something I'm strongly interested in. I'm really curious about your thoughts on that if you've looked into it much, but the whole possible growing movement of lab-grown meat, they're calling it clean meat. I don't know if you have thoughts or feelings about that, or?
So why am I vegan? Well, I'm vegan for several reasons. Certainly, there's a health benefit to me. I mean, the one thing I've seen in all the studies on vegan diet is that the vegan groups are always healthy. Now, if you're going to say they're healthier than other groups, it's a little tougher to do. In the Adventist Health Study, the vegans are the healthiest group except for the pesco-vegetarians. I did go pesco-vegetarian for a while, but my mercury level went really high. I thought that's going to be a bad idea. But I'm also vegan because of the environment. And, I don't want to contribute to animal agriculture in any way, shape, or form. I don't think it's ethical. I think it's horrible for the environment. So there's multiple reasons that I'm going vegan.
The antibiotic overuse, the fossil fuel requirement, the deforestation, the water requirements, those are all totally valid points.
All valid. I don't take that with me into discussing with a patient their medical problems because I don't think it's appropriate in an exam room. But my personal feeling is that we need to think about this as a country because the world is definitely suffering. Now, obviously, lab-grown meat is great for that, right? I mean, we're not going to deforest to grow lab-grown meat, all that kind of stuff. From a health benefit, I worry a bit because when I really get into the data and if you really start getting into mechanism things, I worry about heme iron, and lab-grown meat is heavy in heme iron, and heme iron is a big, strong oxidizer for lipids, and this worries me from heart disease to cancer to other things. So
well, and I guess just to expand a little bit, they've done red meat, they've done poultry, they've done fish, they've done casein, they've done albumin, and even within the red meat, I guess one possible perk about it is that you could easily manipulate any variable like that. You could control that or change that.
Yeah, I would be happy. Yeah, if you drop that down. The other thing I worry about is high IGF-1. So if you look at in leucine specifically, leucine, if you look at some of the anti-aging data, which is always interesting to me because as I hit 50, I don't want to age.
So again, you could change that. You could change the amino acid profile.
Yeah. Well, look, if you could do that, I'd be all game. I'd eat a burger that was, lab raised that isn't going to, what it almost comes down to? It's like, would I eat these Impossible burgers or these Beyond burgers that they're coming out? And the answer is, yeah, I eat them more frequently than I probably should because they're not necessarily healthy for you. But
I wish they were lower in saturated fat.
Yeah, I wish they were. Well, Beyond is, is it Beyond or Impossible? I think one of them is higher, but the other one's lower.
I'm not sure which is which.
Yeah,
one of them was higher. I'm not clear on which was which.
And I think they're coming back with new versions that are lower, but the same idea.
Good.
If you could give me a meat that is low in saturated fat, that is low in IGF-1 stimulation, I would eat it.
I see the movement coming, and I'm sure there's certainly many pitfalls, but I don't know. I'm concerned about whether we could see a high percent of the population just go totally plant-based versus if there's a point at where the average consumer could be in the supermarket and they've got two packages of meat side by side and he knows he's tasted them both. He knows he likes to taste equally well and one is cheaper. I think that's where there could be just a critical mass change.
Yeah, that's where you have to do it. But I mean, look, that's going to have the change has to come way higher. I mean, you've come on something very strong here. Is that it's funny to me that health is not the driver; it's going to be cost.
Well, I guess an analogy that I've heard recently was the idea of whaling and whale oil for lamps. The argument was that for quite some time, people argued against the issue of taking out this intelligent species of animals for this purpose. And honestly, the rates of whaling didn't really change because of that.
Yeah.
But once kerosene was developed and patented and it was cheaper,
Right.
then the industry pretty much just disappeared.
Yeah, which is that would really put
And I think it'd be awesome if we could act upon moral arguments, but we've had many examples in which just simple economics have changed that.
Yeah.
And the clean meat, if it could scale, that's a plausible scenario.
It is. I worry when I look at things like, this whole trade war that's been going on right now has really been affecting the dairy farmers. And of course, then the government goes and gives them subsidy to keep doing what they've always done.
Right.
And that happens all the time. If you look at, we argue about what the USDA should be telling us on how to eat, but their most recent plate is fairly reasonable. It's, the
Sure
fruits, vegetables, some grains, and some protein. But when you look at where the last farm bill put its money, it wasn't towards those things. It was almost exclusively towards meat and dairy.
Right.
And so we would need some really fundamental changes in the way we subsidize these institutions, because what's going to happen with this fake meat is going to be the same thing that's happening right now with milks made from nuts, or soy, or the soy. Now there's laws being passed that you can't call them milk anymore. You can't call it soy milk.
Oh wow.
And you can't. They're trying to get these burgers, these like Beyond Meat burgers, to not be called burgers. You can't even call them.
Oh really?
Oh yeah. There's all this going on.
That's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, but that's what these industries are very strong, and these are very threatening. The amount of dairy intake over the past few years has been dropping rapidly, and it's really affecting these farmers. And what I would want is that we would foster, just like you would with energy, we want to go towards more renewable energy.
Yeah.
How could we take someone that is a coal miner and put them into a clean energy business? Same thing here. How
Sure.
can we get a dairy farmer to change his business over to, a farm that's going to be growing the kind of foods that we think are healthiest for us? And that takes a financial change at a high level. And look, I was at that USDA meeting, and I could not believe the amount of lobbyists present to testify in those meetings. There is a very strong influence from industry on what we eat, and until that changes, it's a battle.
Well, you may know this better than I, but do you see big change coming for that?
I do.
Okay.
I do, because in the end, market forces do have an effect, and I do think that there's been a very strong. I mean, it's amazing to me. Like, for every study that comes out that would be, for instance, meat is bad for you, the meat industry will counter, and it's becoming very almost like the whole fake news thing. Like, I was at that USDA meeting, and there was a dietitian for the Cattle Farmers Institution, and she got up and said that meat is part of a heart healthy diet. Now, I've gone through this literature.
I guess how big of how much of a part,
Yeah, I mean, I just can't. I haven't found a single study that meat is good for your heart.
Yeah,
that I just haven't found it. If someone could send me that literature, I'd be interested. Never seen a study that shows that meat's good for you. So how could she even make that? So it's to make these like outlandish claims, not to have these complex discussions like you and I are having about, well, let's look at the epidemiology and the mechanism.
right. There's some threshold.
Just to come out and say meat's good for your heart.
Wow.
So they're trying so hard, but plant-based foods are rising like crazy.
That's great.
Fast foods are starting to the fast food restaurants are starting to provide these different outlets. Consumers are starting to understand that they do get a vote with their dollar, and that this vote, more so than with their health, but with the environment, makes it different with the environment. And I think these new plant-based meats and these plant-based eggs and things like that are getting such traction that I do see a change coming. And I think that if you look at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, that institution, which was saying, how can we prevent disease to begin with, has grown. Every time I go to that meeting, there's thousands more doctors there. And these doctors are more and more interested in how do we switch to more plant-based diet, not necessarily vegan or vegetarian, but more plant-based. And so there's a growing movement, I think, in medicine. There's a growing movement in the science of plant-based meats, and there's a growing movement in even the fast food industry and in the meat industry. Tyson, one of the biggest meat producers, is starting to look into plant-based meats.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I actually think
They're also looking at the clean meat movement as well.
Yeah.
They're big investors in that.
Yeah, and so this is all fascinating. I mean, you got Bill Gates. His foundation is investing in this. I mean, it's a really big movement, and there's so much benefit to it that we could argue back and forth about the health benefit, but there's clearly an environmental benefit, and there's clearly an ethical benefit, and because we've got all these things going for us, I'm very confident about the changes coming.
That's really encouraging. You know, my big focus has been thyroid disease and endocrinology, and in the natural health space, it frustrates me because I see so many who become unnecessarily fearful of plant-based foods. You know, we have things like the grains, the lectins, the oxalates, the glutens that have gotten people really misled, or soy concerns that I would argue really aren't founded. But I see so many consumers wrapped up in these things that I'm encouraged to hear what you're saying.
But yeah, because people say that to, you know, look, I'll have a patient come in. You know, my doctor said that I have hypothyroidism because I'm vegan.
Ooh.
And that just drives me crazy because
there's some big studies showing the opposite, that vegans have amongst the lowest rates of thyroid disease.
Right. Actually, they did that in the Adventist Health Study. They did one.
Also hyperthyroidism. Yeah.
Yeah. And hyperthyroid too. Right. So, but I said to them, like, what does your doctor tell their meat eating hypothyroid patients? You know, yours is because of autoimmune, but the other person's because so there's a lot of misinformation, but I think, just before you, I was on a phone call with Blue Cross and Blue Shield, who wants me to be a speaker to all their primary care doctors because they feel like their primary care doctors in Alabama aren't getting proper information. But there's this new kind of increased interest in proper science with diet, and so I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged that some of these, I guess I would call them old wives' tales, will change and will go away. Yeah.
Well, this has been great. I think that we really came to a good agreement and went through some wonderful information. So this has been really helpful.
Sure, I've enjoyed it. It's always good to have these kind of complex discussions, and I hope that listeners understand that it is complicated out there. And when I first started writing my book, it was like so difficult to go through all the literature to come up with stuff. And I tried to, be as level-headed, and I wasn't vegan at the when I started this. I was a meat eater who was trying to decide what's the healthiest way to eat. And you can't just look at one study. You got to look at this whole body of research, and it's complex, like we talked about. But I do think there's answers in that complexity. I really do.
Yeah. And I think that over time, science becomes more clear, and there's always things to refine, but we get better at that. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, Dr. Davis, thanks again for your time. You got a busy day ahead of you, and we really appreciate having you on.
No problem. Thank you so much.
All right. And listeners, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk in really soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christensen here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christensen on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much, and I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.